Welcome to Duck Season Somewhere podcast. This episode is brought to you by the following sponsors. For 365 days a year, it's duck season somewhere at Ramsey Russell's GetDucks.com. The world of duck hunting is way bigger than our backyard. The very best duck hunts in Argentina and Mexico are only the beginning. We specialize exclusively in 6 continents worth of proven waterfowl hunting adventures. Whether you're looking for a unicorn species or a fun trigger pulling vacation of epic proportion, we've got the right hunt dialed in. Real duck hunts and authentic experiences for serious duck hunters. As a genuine American duck hunter myself, I know the difference. Founded in 2003, GetDucks.com is not just what we do, it's all we do. I've been there personally many times. Our reputation speaks for itself. Anita and I are personally available to assist before, during, and after your trip because you deserve nothing less. Looking for something closer to home? The next great hunt is closer than you think. Contact proven operators throughout the U.S. and Canada at our U.S. hunt list. Explore worldwide duck hunting at GetDucks.com. All package details, photos, videos, stories, and thousands of client testimonials right there at your fingertips. GetDucks.com. Ball Shot Shell's copper-plated bismuth tin alloy is the good old days again. Steel shots come a long way in the past 30 years, but will never, ever be like good old-fashioned lead. No way. Say goodbye to all the gimmicky, high recoil, compensation, science, and marketing hype, and hello to superior performance. Know your pattern, take ethical shots, make clean kills. That is the boss way. The good old days are now. It really is duck season somewhere for 365 days per year. Duck season somewhere takes me year-round to worldwide destinations where I visit with the most interesting people. I'm your host, Ramsey Russell. Join me here to listen to those conversations. This is Ramsey Russell, GetDucks.com, where it's duck season somewhere. And today is the end cap of a 5-episode series about the Great Basin, about the Great Salt Lakes. And if I said the words market hunting, what would you think? Chesapeake Bay, Sunken Lands, Arkansas? While I was there, I went and visited I kicked off my whole trip with a private hunting camp, very exclusive private hunting camp back on the north end. And one of the members had presented me with a story, a historical reference for this region, and it made my head explode. The author of that article is a local historian named Jack Ray, who is our guest today. He wrote a story called Duck Fever. It's my understanding he may be working on a book about this rich and colorful history north of Salt Lake City. Jack, how are you today?
I'm doing fine. It's good to be here.
Yes, sir. And I know that you duck hunt because I've called you a few times that you were in the duck blind. And I hate to do that. I hate when people call me and I'm in a duck blind because that's when the ducks are really going to start to fly. But Jack, just so people can understand kind of sort of who you are, how long have you duck hunted?
You know, I've duck hunted since I was 12 or 13 years old. Did not come from a duck hunting or hunting family at all. But when we moved to Utah when I was about 10 or 12 years old, we lived close to people who were into duck hunting, and it was very popular. And so my friends and some of the men in the neighborhood would take me out, and I got hooked on it then.
But, it shocks people to know that I did not really come from a duck hunting family. My grandfather duck hunted, and he was in the stages of retirement from the sport when I came along and started getting into it. My dad didn't duck hunt at all, and I fell into it in high school or just after high school with some friends and different people that thankfully introduced me to the sport. But, Jack, one thing that struck me is as I was out there hunting that area, that Great Basin, it was amazing because I'm sandwiched in between the Wasatch and the Promontory Mountains. I haven't said that word right yet, I know, but
Look one way and see one mountain range, look the other. There's all this water in between, and it was amazing to me that anywhere I was standing, I could just look straight across that marsh, 12 to 15 miles, and that's where I had hunted a day or two before, and then a dozen miles north of that exactly, just across marsh, and that's where I'd hunted. But every little niche, nook, and cranny had all these different little micro niches and the different species that we could hunt in that area. But what is your favorite duck species to hunt today? What do you like to target when you go out and hunt?
My favorite species is the pintail. I just love them. I love the way they work. I love seeing them in the air. I love eating them. They're, I think, the best tasting duck out there. And I think they're just a beautiful, elegant bird. But frankly, in terms of what duck is my favorite, it's whatever duck is flying best that day.
The next one over the decoys. I love that. Yeah.
That's right. That's about what it is. Yeah.
Well, here, Jackie, you heard me say in the intro, when I read your article, Duck Fever, it opened up a whole new world and a whole new perspective of your backyard that I was just completely unaware of. I had no idea whatsoever, none. I read it a few times so that I could grasp everything that you covered in there. What must it have been like to hunt that region back in the mid to late 1800s before the railroad had moved in?
A lot of people, when they think of the Great Salt Lake, they think of a dead sea because they know it's really salty and there's no fish in it. And so they think, there must not be much wildlife there, and nothing could be further from the truth. And so when you read the accounts of what it was like when people would go out there even in the earlier 1800s, when explorers would go out, when trappers would go out, and these are people who, were accustomed to seeing huge concentrations of wildlife, throughout the nation. But when they would see the Great Salt Lake and specifically Bear River Bay, which is where you were, they had almost identical descriptions, and that is that they were just amazed, and that when these flocks of millions of ducks would get up in the air off of the Bear River Bay, it would be like the sound of thunder. And that continued even into the late 1800s and early 1900s, and to a somewhat diminished extent continues today. But these people who would go out in the late 1800s, they couldn't come up with descriptions colorful enough to fit what they were seeing at Bear River Bay. They called it the Valhalla of waterfowl, Elysium for ducks, the paradise of duckdom. Just one name after another, trying to give some description to, what they were seeing in front of them. It was just like there were ducks everywhere. It was just an amazing.
And that really says a lot. That really says a lot, because we're talking about the mid to late 1800s, before westward expansion, before all this mass civilization, and there was still everything. The whole continent was practically the same as it had been when it was discovered, let alone out west. So they had a basis of comparison. It wasn't just as compared to the South Delta of Mississippi today. It was compared to then, to sunken land or to Chesapeake Bay or to parts of Europe. That's what's so astounding.
Yeah, exactly. So these are people who would have seen flocks of passenger pigeons. They would have seen the concentrations of waterfowl in the Midwest, before the Kankakee or however that's pronounced, marsh was drained. Yeah. Chesapeake Bay, all of those places. And yet they came here and they talked about when the birds would rise up off the Great Salt Lake, it would sound like 6 freight trains coming down the tracks from a mile away, even when they were a mile away from the birds. So they were just overwhelmed. And, you can see this sense of awe and the sense of wonder in the accounts of people who you think, these people at that time may not have been so into nature or so easily, impressed, kind of a little bit jaded maybe. And yet, here it was a total sense of astonishment.
Yeah, that's incredible. And some of the numbers, like from the market hunters, I know Vince Davis purportedly shot a whole lot of ducks during a 50-day period. It did. What was that number? 4,020 some odd ducks he shot in a 50-day period hunting out there.
He shot
mind numbing.
Yeah, in one 5-day period, and you need to remember he didn't hunt on Sundays, so
a 5-day period.
Yeah. So, 5-day period, he shot over 1,000 ducks. And, in the first 5 weeks of the season one year, he shot 4,100 ducks. In another 50-day period, a few years later, he shot 4,200 ducks. And so, we'll get into a little bit more about him, but, he was a guy who, was just a, prodigious market hunter at the time, and then who became kind of a promoter of the recreational aspects of the Great Salt Lake and started promoting it and marketing it to waterfowlers throughout the country. And, when people started hearing the reports, it didn't take long for people from around the country to start making their way to the Great Salt Lake and the word to get out.
One thing that interested me is, and I thought about this a lot as I was out there hunting with mud motors and airboats, is how those people back then accessed that vast region. How they got just from hard ground to back where the ducks may have been, the teal or the canvasback or whatever they were targeting. And then what they used as decoys, that was very, very, I'd never heard that before. But how do you describe how they would have, because they couldn't walk. I guess they could walk to some areas, but they couldn't walk to all areas out across that mud that was sunk in a lot of silt. How do you remember them getting there and some of the techniques they used to lure the birds within range?
Yeah, so the way they would do it, particularly, along the shore of the lake and then up in Bear River Bay is, I think what people need to understand is the Great Salt Lake is very shallow. And so the areas they would hunt would be just, a couple of inches, 2-3 inches deep. And so initially the boats they would use, these wooden boats, they had built specially for the purpose, and it might almost be better to call them, sleds that would also, float and work on the water. But they would push them across the mud. And, when you get up in those parts of the Great Salt Lake, if the wind shifts, it can push the water out. And so what little flotation you might have gotten, when you were on your way out to go hunting, a couple of miles out there, if the wind shifts and blows the water out, it could bring tears to your eyes. These guys would be out there. These guys would be out there now, and having to push their boat out, across a mud flat. And if they were guiding somebody, they'd have to push the person they were guiding, as well as the 100 big ducks they shot and everything else. But as the story goes, one day Vince Davis was making his way across one of these very shallow areas, and he was using oars to propel the boat. And so as he would oar the boat across, each stroke of the oars would create a little divot of mud. And as he was looking back across this line of divots, he could see flocks of teal swirling around and diving on and then landing among these divots of mud. And so instead of, worrying about decoys or anything else, he would just take a shovel out. And when they would set up the blind or set up where they were going to hunt, they would just turn over spadefuls of mud in the little water so that they would have a few dozen spadefuls of mud surrounding the blind, and the ducks would come into these spadefuls of mud. And when you think about it, that's not too different from the silhouette decoys that people use out on the Great Salt Lake today. I suspect, birds from 100 yards away can't tell those silhouettes are really in the shape of a duck. They're more forms and a mass of objects out on the water, and they associate that with a concentration of ducks, and so they come in. So that's
I think there's a lot of truth to that. Yeah, in fact, it was described to me, there was actually a technique that I've never seen or heard of that they use at times of the year today, where they go out and put that little sled in very, very shallow water and then surround themselves with silhouettes that are pitch black.
Right. Yeah.
Have you seen that? Yeah. Yeah, it's the same thing, isn't it?
It's the same concept. It still works with the green-winged teal, and it still, can be very effective. And so as they would shoot ducks, they would take the ducks and they would put a duck on top of each of these mounds of mud to make them look a little bit more realistic. And so that's how they would hunt. And, you know, if you've ever held an old wooden decoy, those things are heavy. You know, each decoy weighs several pounds. And so when you're in this very shallow water and the thick mud, you know, you really don't want to be carrying around another 30 or, you know, whatever pounds of, 40 pounds of decoys in your boat. You want things to be as light as possible.
Man, I'm all about that. I guarantee you. What, you know what? It's funny how when you like watch the History Channel, all this time I've watched the History Channel and understand the economic significance of the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific railroads, one from New York, one from out west, colliding in the Midwest, and what it did for American infrastructure and American economy. But, you know, I never really thought about how it must have impacted duck hunting. And what I gathered while out in Utah was, first of all, I guess I just didn't pay close enough attention to realize that they joined in Utah. I was thinking more along the middle of the United States if somebody had asked, but it was right there, not too far from the Bear River Bay that those two railroads collided. And as I understand it, that really had a significant impact on how a man like Vince Davis and some of these formation of these old clubs, how they came to be. It just made that part of the world very accessible all of a sudden.
Yeah, it did. So as you mentioned, the two rail lines came together almost just a stone's throw from the North Shore of the Great Salt Lake. And what that did is it opened up all of the markets in the east to waterfowl from the Great Salt Lake. And so you had this huge concentration of waterfowl just literally a couple of miles from the rail line. And people could go out and shoot these ducks and send them back east. Now, before that, there had been market hunting, but it was primarily for the local markets. People in Utah really valued waterfowl as a delicacy. In fact, they noted that when ducks would start hitting the market in Salt Lake City, the market for chickens would dry up because people, preferred to eat wild duck to chicken. And they would talk about the ducks being, quote, fat as little pigs, so people just love to eat waterfowl. And, I think people have kind of forgotten how to cook duck in modern times. I think a little bit of that is coming back now, but you hear the old jokes, about cooking duck on a board and then throwing the duck away and eating the board and everything. That would have been really shocking to the ears of people back in 1900. And I think to those today who know how to cook ducks, it's also shocking. But, they love to eat ducks. And so they got a lot of ducks on the market and started sending ducks around the country. And Utah became concerned pretty early on that too many ducks were being shipped out of the state. That it would have really a negative impact on the waterfowl populations on the Great Salt Lake. And so by 1900, Utah had banned the export of ducks. They allowed them still to be sold within the state, but not out of the state. And so ducks would be shipped, surreptitiously, I guess. They'd be shipped under false pretenses, in crates marked butter or, other products out of state. Mm-hmm. And, it's kind of interesting. Back then, the duck that fetched the highest price on the market would be canvasbacks from the Chesapeake Bay, back on the East Coast. And, they would get, several times the price of, big ducks anywhere else. And so some enterprising folks on the north end of the Great Salt Lake named their duck camp the Chesapeake Bay Duck Club so that they could stamp on the box.
Yeah.
So they could stamp on the box, ducks Chesapeake Bay, and they could get the Chesapeake Bay premium.
That camp is still in existence, is it not?
Yes, it is. It exists today. They dropped the name Bay or the word Bay from their name, but it still exists as the Chesapeake Duck Club, and it's one of the one of the better duck clubs on the lake, and there are a lot of duck clubs, but that's certainly one of the finest.
Well, that brings up a very good point. Is I was astounded to learn just how many duck camps there were, more than one or two or three that have existed for well over 100 years in the region. Can you describe that? How many clubs there might be, or?
Yeah, so back,
clubs.
yeah, around 1890. In fact, this was Vincent Davis again. So he was a farmer. He homesteaded some of the sort of semi-barren land out by the mouths of the Bear River, and decided instead of just strictly market hunting himself, he would also open a duck camp because he noticed that people were wanting to come out there duck hunting. And so he developed this duck camp on his property out there where people would pay to come out and hunt ducks with him. And that was in 1890, and people saw the success of that. And so duck camps started, popping up around the Great Salt Lake. And there were other ones on the North Shore, and on the South Shore, they mostly catered to local residents and would charge a daily fee for people to hunt their property or different things. But as time went on, of course, there were people who wanted to have some exclusive access to property, and so they started forming duck clubs. And the first duck club would have been in the 1890s on the South Shore of the Great Salt Lake down by Salt Lake City. And that would have been the New State Duck Club, which is still in existence today and still very vibrant.
It is.
Over 3,000 acres in size. And
Wow.
they have, they've been very tenacious in terms of preserving themselves, as have many of the duck clubs. But most of the duck clubs that exist today are 100 years or more old. So
That's
they've hung
incredible.
on.
And that just to me is utterly incredible. And what I came to realize as I was out there is the role in conservation those men became. All we hunters preach conservation. Hunters is conservation because of the excise tax we pay in the Pittman-Robertson Act, or the duck stamps we buy, and all this stuff. But man, here we're, and this wasn't just citizens and politicians from Salt Lake City. They were coming from all over the United States, if not the world, to own a stake in some of this incredible duck hunting. And today, a lot of the property that has not been developed or been dried up, but that is still under very active management, belongs to these private clubs. Is that correct?
Yeah, so duck clubs formed on about, today they encompass somewhere around 40,000 acres of habitat around the Great Salt Lake. And today, the wetland habitat pretty much ends at the gates of the duck clubs. And there are a couple of nature preserves, and of course there's some state waterfowl management areas that we'll get into maybe later. But all of the other wetlands that existed that weren't preserved by duck clubs, basically, today they're under refineries, they're under industrial complexes, they're under roads and, one thing or another. And it's really those duck hunters back in the late 1800s and early 1900s who managed to save a huge chunk of the Great Salt Lake ecosystem. And what it did, it's hard to overstate just how important duck hunting was in Utah 100 years ago. It was called the national sport of the state, and it was said that you could stand on, a building in Salt Lake City and look out across, the valley to the west towards the lake, and there would be so many campfires of duck hunters out in the marshes surrounding the Great Salt Lake that it would look like a prairie fire approaching. And, just extending for miles and miles. And most of those natural wetlands have been lost, and the wetlands that remain were wetlands that were either natural or that were created by the duck clubs. And they have persisted, in the face of all of the development that has occurred. And, you got to realize that 80% of the state's population exists basically kind of surrounding the Great Salt Lake and extending down to another, big lake, Utah Lake. And, those are the people who are consuming water. Those are the people who need roads to drive on, who are building buildings, who are building one thing or another. And so there has been just massive pressure placed on the Great Salt Lake ecosystem and the Great Salt Lake marshlands, over the past century. And in the face of all of that, these duck clubs have, held fast. They've resisted temptation to sell out. They've resisted pressure trying to push them away. They've resisted drainage schemes of one type or another, water grabs, you name it, and they have hung on. And, they also happened to trigger, because they were, tying up land for their hunting, then people who didn't belong to a duck club complained and, said, well, hey, they're cutting us off from these hunting areas. And so that pushed the state then to acquire tens of thousands of acres of additional habitat, or set aside tens of thousands of acres of additional habitat around the Great Salt Lake, so that we now have a string of state waterfowl management areas that extend literally from the south shore of the lake to the north shore of the lake. And that started back in the 19-teens and 1920s, that the state started the process of doing that at a time when, most other states thought the only good marsh was a drained marsh. That's what you do with marshes, is you drain them and you turn them into something else. And in Utah at that same time, they were setting aside, the first one was called the public shooting grounds. I guess that wouldn't be a politically correct name for, a refuge today, but that was what they did it for. They did it because of duck hunting. So you have the second driest state in the nation, with all of its development concentrated in the same place as the marshes, in a very conservative state. And yet they set aside all of this land and all of this water. And it isn't just because they thought it would be neat for, ducks to have plenty of fresh water to drink. They did it, because they wanted these areas to be preserved so that people would have a place to go and experience the marsh as a duck hunter. Because a lot of them were duck hunters and they had been out there, and, maybe they didn't get misty-eyed every time, the sun set over the marsh, but they knew what it was like to be out there, and they knew what it was like to see that, and they understood that it was an important thing in the state's culture and heritage, and so they preserved it.
Well, one thing I gathered listening to you and reading that duck fever article and gaining this context is, today, if you get on the chat rooms and get into the social media, it's a prevailing thought that we have too many hunters on not enough land. And it was a slap in my face, just wham, it woke me up to like, wait a minute, this isn't a modern day issue. This has existed since the 19th century, because just as you described, back in those days, as some of these investors started buying land for their private use, there became an uproar because there was a lot of hunters on land, a decreased base, and but state responded by adding more land to accommodate more people for the tradition of hunting. But still, I marveled that there was there were a lot of hunters stacked in at times to a small, relatively small part of piece of property. And that's what struck me, that this is not a modern day dilemma in duck hunting. It's existed for as long as, I guess, duck hunting has, as a recreational sport. Because, around the same time, that's what this story is kind of alluding to, is around the same time that the two rail lines met, there was a transition nationwide, if not worldwide, but certainly in the Utah area, from market hunting to mass recreational value in hunting, and almost immediately there were people that felt disenfranchised, that didn't have an opportunity to hunt, couldn't afford to hunt, or didn't want to spend the money on a piece of property, that all of a sudden needed somewhere to hunt. And so it's really, for as long as recreational duck hunting has existed, there has been people grinding the axe about not having somewhere to duck hunt. And that's what struck me. They say history repeats itself, and that's just what struck me as this narrative of the history of Utah unfolded. But going back to Vince Davis, we drove by up on the north end one day. We drove by a sign that is now in National Wildlife Refuge called Duckville. What was Duckville at the time?
So Duckville was a name that Vince Davis gave to his original duck camp. And so Vince Davis was sometimes called the Duke of Duckville. But Duckville was the name he gave to his camp. And then, when people started coming out, eventually, industrialists from Denver and back east got interested in acquiring some of this land. And so they purchased his land. And he had kind of two locations of his duck camp. And one became a club, the Bear River Club, that still exists today, and the other one was Duckville. And so Duckville continued on as a club until there were floods on the Great Salt Lake that kind of raised the level of the lake. The lake froze, and then basically the shifting ice leveled everything out there. But they really were a fascinating club. They kind of catered to both Salt Lake City folks as well as to there were a number of like actors from Hollywood and different things who would hunt there. Andy Devine and Wallace Beery, I think, was another one. And so they had that clientele. And, interestingly, just this is a little aside, a lot of these duck clubs would have full-time caretakers and families that would live out in the marsh, and they would power the place, the lights and the stove and everything with gas that they would take out of the marsh. So they would drill down for water, and the water would have a lot of gas mixed in with it, and they would separate the water and the gas, and they'd use the gas to power lamps and stoves and different things like that. So just kind of an interesting aside. But wow, what you had said earlier about the disputes between different groups of duck hunters is really something that has continued on. I mean, more things change, the more they remain the same, I guess. But when the clubs initially started acquiring land, that resulted in a number of lawsuits brought in order to establish the right of the duck clubs to control access to the waters on their property. And so it led to, well, not just water rights, but actually access to the waters. And so people said that because it was wet, they had a right as a member of the public to go on it, essentially. And the courts uniformly upheld the right of the clubs to control access to the waters on their property. And so that resolved that. And because those court decisions were resolved that way, that left the legislature then with the choice and the directive, essentially the decision that, okay, we're going to start establishing these public hunting areas. And so they started establishing public shooting grounds, essentially. And now probably again, 80% of the state's population is within 30 minutes of a state-managed waterfowl management area where during the season you can go out 7 days a week. You don't have to draw for a blind. You don't have to, worry about any of that stuff. You can just go out and go duck hunting. And that's a tremendous, legacy that we in our era have that was gifted to us because of the, basically the fervor of all of these duck hunters back in the early part of the 20th century.
And it truly is. I will say this: I've not hunted everywhere in the United States, but I've hunted a lot of places, and I cut my teeth on public land in the deep South. That's where I learned to duck hunt, and it was astounding, the public land opportunities in Utah. And depending on how well equipped you were to get further from the boat ramp, it amazed me that we 4 or 5 guys could jump in an airboat and trek off and get somewhere that, knowing there were 15 or 20 boats at the boat ramp when we left, or 15 or vehicles there, so there were a lot of hunting parties there. Yet we didn't hear a single gunshot while we were hunting, and that's a vast area that is available for public. I really can't think of anywhere else that has that kind of opportunity for public land hunters in the United States. If it is, I'm completely unaware of it. I it really was impressive. It was very, very impressive. And I know we met with Rich Hansen that manages Ogden and several of those WMAs. Wow, I got the tour of Ogden Bay and a lot of the Phragmites control he's doing and a lot of the habitat creation he's doing. For example, the state of Utah has this clever program because duck bans are all that and more to some people. You can enter this duck slam contest for $20, and as you shoot a mouter limit or a teal limit or a goose limit or a diver slam or something, you can be awarded a band. But what they do with those revenues, $20 per entry, they leverage for federal funding, and it ends up in Rich's budget. And all of a sudden, he's showing me a quarter section of former Phragmites, dry Phragmites, that is now just a lush, productive wetland available for hunters. And it astounded me at how well managed some of these properties were, and how accessible they were, and a lot of the amenities, to cross those dikes or canals. They had little land bridges so that the public could access areas. I was just absolutely blown away that there was that much public land hunting opportunity. But Jack, what I know that as you were talking about the water access or access to the water for some of these clubs, and it becoming involved legislatively and things. Can we talk about some of the today's issues? We've talked about all the needs for water. I've heard that the population in the valley is going to double in the next 20 years, and it's going to be this. More and more people. You've got industry, you've got civil humans, neighborhoods. You've got all these competing interests for water. But I know that you were involved. Somehow to protect some of the historic clubs from becoming developments. Can you expound on that subject?
Yeah. So one of the hats I wear is I'm president of the Utah Waterfowl Association, and so we concluded when we created the Waterfowl Association probably close to about 15 years or so ago now, that there was a real need for duck hunters to engage in the legislative and policy-making process. That role really was not being filled by any group, and that the big decisions that would control the fate of the Great Salt Lake and therefore the fate of duck hunting in Utah would be happening at the state capitol and in city councils and county commissions. And duck hunters needed to have a voice there. They needed to engage in that process. For too long, I think, the waterfowling community had just kind of, kept its head down and crossed their fingers and hoped for the best. And with the growing population, and a population that's going to be continuing to grow for decades to come, as you mentioned, with increasing demands on water and everything else, that need is more and more urgent. And so we got involved, and thankfully now, Ducks Unlimited, I think thanks to the insight and efforts of Gary Link, who's their Western Region Policy Director, and another Western Region Officer, Jeff McCurry, they have begun recently to play a significant role on the policy front here in Utah as well, because I think they recognize the critical need of it. But one of the things the Utah Waterfowl Association did is we were concerned that encroaching development was going to be placing increasing and almost, overwhelming pressure on the duck clubs, because they exist where all of these people live. And so we drafted and presented to the legislature a bill that designates these duck clubs, and it could be a private nature preserve as well, like Audubon property or something like that, as migratory bird production areas. And they are given protections against nuisance complaints. They're given protections against annexation. They're protected against any county enacting any ordinance that would curtail their traditional waterfowl management and hunting activities. And so it provides them with the tools they need to survive, going through this next century. And, hopefully we'll see them survive, another 100 years. I know when I have been engaged in discussions with, with legislators and others, or with developers, and they, try to reassure me and say, oh, don't worry, that won't happen for 5 or 10 or 15 years. I have to tell them, no, that's not the time frame we're looking at. We're looking out beyond the horizon. We have a legacy that extends back well over 100 years, and we want that legacy to extend off into the future for as far as we can see. For children, for grandchildren, and for other people like me who, didn't come from a hunting family. They got addicted to the marsh because, I would put on cheap, uninsulated rubber hip boots and, trudge out into the marsh on Saturdays with my friends and get cold and get numb feet. And then, as the sun would go down, the sky would turn orange and the water would turn orange and the air would fill with ducks and whistling wings going past your head. And so, people need to have those experiences. And so we need to preserve this legacy. And, that's going to require getting involved. It's going to require getting engaged in ways that I think duck hunters have not normally been used to getting involved in. They're used to doing banquets and thank heavens, we do banquets and raise money and get people excited that way. And, I take my hat off to everyone who's involved in those things. But we've got to also engage in the policy arena, and we've got to engage in the legislative arena, and we've got to stand up for ourselves and be willing to draw a line and say, thus far and no further. And, we're going to fight. And that's what we have to do.
Jack, that brings us to a very good point. I would dare say that every person listening right now, whether they're in the state of Utah or not, many or not, there's a wetland, there's a habitat to which their tradition and their children's future is dependent. Who's protecting it? I would ask. Who is protecting that? Who is championing the future of hunting in your backyard? I would ask anybody listening. You brought up a very good point, Jack. What would be your suggestions as someone that has fought this battle legislatively, that has become involved at the level that you have in Utah? What would you suggest to a 22-year-old in Mississippi or a 30-year-old in Kansas or someone in Maryland? What would you suggest of how, beyond the raffle tickets, they could become involved and initiate or have a meaningful voice in conservation today?
I think, one of the first things you need to do is you need to pay attention. So you need to, pay attention when there's a proposal that's going to drain a marsh or that's going to bring development close to, your marsh or your duck club or, wherever it happens to be. And then you need to talk to people and you need to get them, organized. And I'm not talking about, grabbing the pitchforks and the torches and, storming the castle kind of thing. But I think
in the era of social media, you can create visibility towards issues, and everybody has access to a telephone that they can call their congressman. Everybody.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, what I have started doing is I take legislators, I take city councilors and others, and I take them duck hunting, or I take them out into the marsh. Not all of them, are interested in duck hunting. And for those who would just like to see it, I take them out there. And, it is an illuminating experience for them. They get out into the marsh and they see what is out there, and they see the bird life and they see the beauty of the marsh. And it provides them with a perspective and a sense of connection and a sense of ownership that they did not have before they walked through the gates of that duck club or that marsh. A lot of times they're taken places where they stand in the parking lot and they're, somebody, points to a seagull sitting on the water half a mile away and, swatting mosquitoes or something like that. I get them in a boat. We put them in a boat and I, drive them out into the marsh and they see birds swirling around, their heads and rising up off the water. And I've taken, bureaucrats from government out there, and sometimes it doesn't mean they're going to vote my way every time. It doesn't mean they're always going to see eye to eye with me. But it means they're going to have a degree of sensitivity and appreciation that they didn't have before, and that it's more likely that they're going to be taking those things into consideration as legislation is crafted, as policy decisions are made, as planning decisions are made. And, it has had a significant impact. And I've had people come back, after one of those things who may not have cared much about the Great Salt Lake before, and, it's kind of awing to them. And they just ask me, Jack, what can we do to save this? So
that's a very strong message. I look at it like children. As a daddy, I raise my kids, to love the outdoors and to love hunting and stuff. But I've always thought of it like people only know about the things that they actually touch, and they only care about the things that they know. And so it starts with touching. If you're going to get people, politicians or non-hunters or anybody, to truly care about something, you've got to let them touch it. You've got to immerse them into it and expose them to it. And that really, I know this may have been a little bit backwards describing the ecological significance of the Great Salt Lakes, but when I think back to my experience in Utah for nearly 10 days, it was such an amazing, almost indescribable experience because, out there on the flats, running in a boat or an airboat, it was like surfing on glass. It's like if I tried to video it, you could see the decoy bags flopping and, the dog's ears flopping, but otherwise it looked like you were motionless on just sitting motionless, surfing across silver. And at times in the sunrise with the clouds reflecting on the water, it really was one of those moments like Forrest Gump described, not knowing where heaven stopped and the earth began. The shorebirds, so we saw a lot of ducks, a lot of species of ducks, swans, geese, but just the shorebirds. A lot of those different shorebirds we saw racing across those mud flats in an airboat going duck hunting was just like going across those mud flats down in Sonora, Mexico against the Sea of Cortez in February. Same shorebirds, in fact. It was just the same species queuing into the same habitat type, just shorebirds by the bazillions. Was an amazing. Could you speak of why all these conservation things we're talking about in the Great Salt Lake? Could you just expound on some of the factoids of the Great Salt Lake in terms of ducks and shorebirds and things of that nature?
Yeah, so the Great Salt Lake, I think, is the largest natural water body in the continental United States west of the Mississippi. And it is, it's kind of, if you were to think of like, British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan having a, funnel, the big end of the funnel, stretching across those three provinces. And then it narrows down. The tip of that funnel is the Great Salt Lake. And most of those birds work along the eastern side of the Great Salt Lake. And they migrate, some species migrate all the way to Argentina. And so there's something like 10 million birds a year that pass through the Great Salt Lake, including about 7 million ducks. Well over half of the continental population of tundra swans passes through the Great Salt Lake. 40% of the continental population of eared grebes, a quarter of the continental population of cinnamon teal breeds on the Great Salt Lake. You could just go through species after species. And, if the Great Salt Lake went down, if it were dewatered, if it ceased to, serve its role in the Western Hemisphere, because the marshes along the Great Salt Lake, the duck clumps along the Great Salt Lake, the refuges, lost their water or whatever the case may be, populations of birds throughout, the continental U.S., the western half of the continental U.S., would be dramatically diminished. In fact, this was recognized as far back as the 1920s. The whole reason that the Bear River Bird Refuge was created is because duck hunters throughout the western United States were worried that if Bear River Bay went down, waterfowling in the western United States would collapse. And that may be a bit of an overstatement, but it's not much of an overstatement when you consider several different bird species, that we don't hunt, but like grebes and phalaropes, as well as, other species. If you lost the Great Salt Lake, there would be this tremendous, vacuum. It would become a desert. There wouldn't be any place for these birds to go and to feed. And some of these species will double their body weight on the Great Salt Lake before they're continuing their migration to Central and South America. So you really can't, overstate the importance. And because these saline lakes are terminal lakes, they're at the end of the pipe. And so they're the last ones to get the water. And if that water is sucked up, for other uses, which may be good uses, but if nothing's left over for these lakes, they dry up. You look at what, happened to the Aral Sea and, in the former Soviet Union and other saline lakes around the world, and they become, just these dust bowls that create health hazards for the people in the surrounding areas, and the whole, natural system is lost. And so, I heard a refuge manager once say about the Great Salt Lake, and I really don't believe it's an overstatement. As I've looked at it, I think it's completely accurate. He said, the Great Salt Lake is just as large and probably more ecologically important than the Florida Everglades. And,
wow.
People probably haven't heard that, but if you look at the bird numbers and the bird species that depend on the Great Salt Lake, you could make that argument pretty convincingly.
Yes, you could. And the people and the hunters that are dependent on it, that's profound. But Jack, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your knowledge of the history of this region. I find the topic fascinating.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
And folks listening, hunters as conservationists, that's a drive home point. We hunters are conservationists. Yeah, we go out and shoot ducks, but it's the benefit that the wildlife and society at large generates. Thank y'all for listening to this podcast. At Ramsey Russell Get Ducks on Instagram. We storyline all of these stories. We go a little bit further in depth. Please take a look. And I'll see y'all next time. Thank y'all again for listening.
Duck Season Somewhere is produced by Ben Page. Original soundtrack by our friend Cody Huggins.